November 14th, 1991, 11:47 p.m. Severomorsk Naval Base, Murmansk Oblast, Russia. Captain First Rank Dmitry Volkov's hands trembled as he slid the classified folder across the metal desk. The document inside bore the stamp that every Soviet naval officer knew meant death if discovered in the wrong hands. Soversheno Sekretno. Top secret. Special importance. In exactly 6 hours, this document would vanish from the Northern Fleet's intelligence archives. And with it, the most closely guarded secret in Soviet submarine warfare. The terrifying truth about why every Akula-class captain who had encountered the American Seawolf prototype had returned to port a changed man. But Dmitry Volkov wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about the 43 submariners who had died aboard K-278 Komsomolets 2 years earlier. He was thinking about the 16 men entombed forever in K-141 Kursk, whose fate would come 9 years later, but whose death sentence was already written in the very document he now held. The Soviet submarine fleet was built on a lie, and tonight that lie would be exposed. What happened next would reshape the entire balance of underwater power between two superpowers. It would reveal capabilities so advanced that Soviet admirals refused to believe them. And it would explain why, for the first time in the Cold War, Russian submarine captains began requesting early retirement rather than face what lurked beneath the Arctic ice. If you find this story as incredible as the men who lived it, take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. The truth about what happened in those frozen waters deserves to be told, and your support helps us bring these hidden chapters of history to light. Now, to understand how we arrived at that freezing night in Severomorsk, we need to go back to a time when the ocean depths became the most dangerous battlefield on Earth. September 3rd, 1983, the Pacific Ocean, 200 nautical miles east of the Kamchatka Peninsula. Commander Viktor Fedorov stood in the attack center of K-324, a Victor III-class nuclear submarine watching the sonar display with growing unease. For the past 6 hours, they had been tracking what they believed was an American Los Angeles-class submarine, a formidable opponent, but one the Soviet Navy had learned to respect rather than fear. The Americans were good, perhaps the best surface ship operators in the world, but underwater, the Soviet Union had spent 40 years and billions of rubles ensuring that the depths belonged to them. The Typhoon-class boomers carried enough nuclear warheads to vaporize every major American city twice over. The Oscar-class cruise missile submarines could sink entire carrier battle groups. And the attack submarines, from the hunters, could track and destroy any threat before it even knew it was being hunted. Or so Viktor Fedorov believed. "Captain," his sonar operator said, his voice tight with confusion. "Contact Sierra 1 has disappeared." Fedorov moved to the sonar station, leaning over the young officer's shoulder. The screen showed nothing but the ambient noise of the ocean, the distant songs of whales, the rumble of a merchant vessel 40 kilometers to the south, the whisper of currents flowing around underwater mountains. "Disappeared? Submarines don't disappear, Lieutenant. They go quiet. They change depth. They don't simply vanish." "I understand, Captain, but one moment he was there, making 7 knots on course 220, and then—" The lieutenant spread his hands helplessly. Nothing, as if he was never there. What Commander Fedorov didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the submarine he had been tracking wasn't a Los Angeles-class at all. It was USS Memphis, one of the improved Los Angeles boats equipped with the new BSY-1 combat system, and Memphis hadn't disappeared. She had simply stopped making noise. The American captain had ordered his boat to ultra-quiet operations, reducing speed to bare steerage way, shutting down all non-essential systems, and essentially transforming his submarine into a hole in the water. It was a capability the Soviet Navy knew the Americans possessed. What they didn't know was how effectively the Americans had perfected it. For the next 4 hours, Memphis shadowed K-324 at a distance of less than 2,000 yards, close enough to photograph the Soviet boat's hull through her periscope, close enough to record every sound her machinery made, close enough to launch a torpedo that would strike before the Russian sonar operators even detected the weapon in the water. When K-324 finally returned to Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, Commander Fedorov filed a routine patrol report. "Contact with American submarine," he wrote. "Contact lost due to environmental conditions." He never mentioned his suspicion that the Americans hadn't been lost at all, that they had simply chosen to stop being found. That suspicion would haunt him for years. And when the first intelligence reports about something called the Seawolf program began filtering through Soviet naval intelligence in 1985, Viktor Fedorov would be one of the few officers who understood what it truly meant. But that understanding would come too late. The story of the Seawolf-Class begins not in a shipyard or a design bureau, but in a moment of pure, undiluted terror. January 1980, the Norwegian Sea. The American submarine USS Batfish was conducting what the Navy called special operations, following Soviet submarines as they transited from their bases in Murmansk to their patrol areas in the Atlantic. For 3 days, Batfish had been trailing a Soviet Delta III ballistic missile submarine, documenting her patrol patterns, recording her acoustic signature, and gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable if the Cold War ever turned hot. Then, on the 4th day, something changed. "Captain to sonar," the intercom crackled aboard Batfish. Commander Thomas Anderson, a 20-year submarine veteran, made his way forward to the sonar shack, expecting a routine update. What he found instead would change the trajectory of American submarine development. "Sir, we've lost the Delta," Senior Chief Petty Officer Marcus Cole said, his face illuminated by the green glow of the sonar displays. "But we've gained something else." Anderson studied the waterfall display, watching the frequencies cascade down the screen like a frozen waterfall. There, barely visible among the ocean's natural noise, was a trace so faint it might have been a ghost. "What am I looking at, Senior Chief?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me, Captain. Because according to our intelligence, there's nothing in the Soviet Navy that should be that quiet." The contact was real. Over the next 12 hours, Batfish's sonar team worked to isolate and identify the acoustic signature. What they discovered sent a chill down Commander Anderson's spine that had nothing to do with the Arctic waters above them. The contact was a submarine, a Soviet submarine. And it was quieter than anything the American intelligence community had predicted the Soviets could build for at least another decade. The Russians had leapfrogged years of acoustic development. They had stolen, borrowed, or independently discovered technologies that Western analysts believed were exclusively American. They had, in naval parlance, closed the gap. When USS Batfish returned to port and her intelligence take was analyzed, the results triggered an emergency meeting at the Pentagon. The submarine that Batfish had detected was later identified as K-284, the first of the Akula-Class attack submarines. And her acoustic signature represented the most significant threat to American naval superiority since the Soviet Union first acquired nuclear weapons. The Akula wasn't just quiet, she was quiet enough to hunt American submarines, quiet enough to track American aircraft carriers, quiet enough to potentially survive long enough to launch her weapons in a war. For the first time since World War II, American submarine commanders faced the possibility of meeting an enemy they couldn't hear coming. The response to this threat would consume billions of dollars, push engineering to its absolute limits, and ultimately produce the most advanced attack submarine ever built, the Seawolf-Class. But that response would take years to develop. And in the meantime, the Akula-Class began entering service in numbers that kept Pentagon planners awake at night. The man who would ultimately command the effort to counter the Akula threat was Admiral Frank Kelso, who would later become Chief of Naval Operations. In 1985, as commander of the Atlantic Fleet's submarine force, Kelso received a briefing that would shape his career. "Show me the projections," he said to the intelligence officer standing before the wall-sized chart of the Atlantic Ocean. The officer pressed a button, and red circles began appearing on the map. Each circle represented an Akula-class submarine. By 1990, the projections showed the Soviet Navy would have 25 of these boats operational. By 1995, potentially 40. "And our Los Angeles-class boats?" Kelso asked. "Adequate against current threats, Admiral, against the Akula, marginal at best. In a one-on-one engagement, we estimate roughly even odds." Even odds? In submarine warfare, even odds meant both boats died. It meant thousands of trained submariners killed in underwater duels that might last only minutes. It meant the potential loss of American naval superiority in the one domain where the United States had held unchallenged supremacy for decades. "What do we need?" Kelso asked. "Sir, we need a submarine that can find the Akula before it finds us. We need a submarine that can track these boats, engage them, and survive. We need a submarine that will give us back the decisive advantage we've held since 1945. The Admiral stared at the map, at the red circles spreading across the Atlantic like a disease. "Then build it." The program that would eventually produce the Seawolf-Class was initiated under the code name Submarine Advanced Development. Its requirements were simple to state and almost impossible to achieve. Build a submarine that could detect any threat at range, remain undetected while closing to attack, and destroy its target with absolute certainty. The submarine that emerged from this program would be unlike anything that had come before, but its development would be shrouded in secrecy so complete that even most Navy officers knew nothing of its capabilities. What few people realized at the time was that Soviet intelligence was desperately trying to penetrate this veil of secrecy. And in one crucial aspect, they would succeed, though not in the way anyone expected. The document that would eventually find its way into Dmitry Volkov's hands began its life in the office of a man named Andrei Kuznetsov. Kuznetsov was not a spy. He was not a naval officer. He was, in fact, a civilian analyst working for the Soviet Academy of Sciences, assigned to a department that officially studied marine acoustics for commercial fishing applications. In reality, Kuznetsov and his team analyzed every piece of intelligence the Soviet Union could gather about American submarine technology. They studied acoustic recordings captured by Soviet submarines and listening posts. They examined photographs taken by Soviet satellites and intelligence vessels. They reviewed reports from agents embedded in American defense contractors. And in February 1989, they received something that made Kuznetsov question everything he thought he knew about the limits of naval engineering. The source of this intelligence has never been officially confirmed. Some historians believe it came from a disgruntled employee at Electric Boat, the Connecticut shipyard where the Seawolf was being constructed. Others suggest it was obtained through technical means, perhaps from signals intercepts or compromised computer systems. What matters is what the intelligence revealed. The first Seawolf-Class submarine, USS Seawolf herself, was being built with capabilities that Soviet analysts had previously dismissed as impossible. Her reactor plant was so quiet that, at low speeds, it produced less noise than the ocean's own ambient background. Her hull was being constructed from a steel alloy that could withstand pressures found only in the deepest trenches, giving her a depth capability that no Soviet torpedo could match. Her sonar system was so sensitive that it could theoretically detect a submarine at ranges exceeding 100 nautical miles under ideal conditions. But the detail that truly horrified Kuznetsov, the detail that would eventually make its way into the document Dmitry Volkov would steal, concerned the Seawolf's weapon system. The submarine was being designed with 8 torpedo tubes compared to the Los Angeles-class's 4. She would carry 50 weapons compared to the Los Angeles's 26. And those weapons would include a new generation of torpedoes with capabilities that rendered Soviet countermeasures essentially useless. When Kuznetsov presented his findings to the Soviet Navy's high command, the response was predictable. They didn't believe him. American propaganda, Admiral Vladimir Chernovin declared, tossing the report onto his desk, designed to frighten us into overspending on countermeasures. The laws of physics apply to everyone, including the Americans. A submarine cannot be this quiet. A hull cannot withstand these pressures. A sonar cannot achieve these ranges. Kuznetsov had expected this reaction. Soviet military culture did not reward bearers of bad news. Officers who reported enemy capabilities, honestly, were often accused of defeatism, or worse, of being American agents themselves. With respect, Admiral, Kuznetsov said carefully, the intelligence has been verified through multiple independent sources. The Americans are not exaggerating. If anything, they may be understating their capabilities for security reasons. Chernovin's face hardened. Then what do you suggest, comrade analyst? That we abandon the submarine force? That we surrender the oceans to the Americans? I suggest, Admiral, that we understand the threat we face. Only then can we respond appropriately. The response Chernovin chose was not what Kuznetsov had hoped for. Rather than accelerating development of quieter submarines or more capable sensors, the Admiral ordered a simple solution. Classify the entire report at the highest level of secrecy and distribute it only to those who absolutely needed to know. The reasoning was coldly logical. If Soviet submarine captains knew what they truly faced, they might lose confidence. They might hesitate at crucial moments. They might, in the most extreme cases, refuse to carry out their duties. Better, Chernovin decided, to let them believe in their own invincibility. It was a decision that would cost lives. The first operational deployment of USS Seawolf took place in 1997, 6 years after the Soviet Union's collapse. By that point, the Russian Navy, heir to the Soviet fleet, was a shadow of its former self. Submarines rusted at their piers. Training exercises became rare luxuries. The proud submariners who had once challenged American dominance struggled simply to keep their boats seaworthy. But the Akula-class submarines remained a potent force. Russia could no longer afford to build new boats in significant numbers, but the Akulas already in service continued to patrol, and their commanders continued to believe in their superiority. Captain Second Rank Pavel Kuznetsov, no relation to the analyst, commanded K-157 Vepr, an Akula-class submarine operating in the Barents Sea during the autumn of 1997. His mission was routine: demonstrate Russian naval presence in waters that NATO seemed increasingly eager to claim as its own. What happened during that patrol would remain classified by both the Russian and American governments for nearly 2 decades. The encounter began on October 14, 1997, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon Moscow time. K-157 was cruising at a depth of 180 meters, making 8 knots on a northwesterly heading. Captain Kuznetsov was reviewing paperwork in his stateroom when the intercom buzzed. Captain to the attack center, sonar contact bearing 340. Kuznetsov made his way forward. moving through the narrow passageways with the easy grace of a man who had spent most of his adult life in these steel corridors. When he reached the attack center, his sonar officer was hunched over the displays, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Report," Kuznetsov ordered. "Contact designated Sierra 1, bearing 340, range uncertain. Classification..." The lieutenant paused, his confusion evident. "Unknown, Captain. I've never heard anything like it." Kuznetsov moved to the sonar station and donned a set of headphones. For several long moments he listened to the faint sounds captured by his submarine's passive arrays. What he heard, or rather what he didn't hear, made his blood run cold. There was something out there, something massive judging by the faint disturbance in the water column, something moving with purpose, but it made almost no noise. The slight whisper of its propulsor, the barely perceptible hum of its machinery. These sounds were so quiet that they registered only sporadically, like a whisper in a hurricane. "American?" Kuznetsov asked, though he already knew the answer. "Almost certainly, Captain, but the acoustic signature doesn't match any Los Angeles-class variant in our database. It doesn't match anything in our database." Kuznetsov felt a chill that had nothing to do with the submarine's air conditioning. He had heard rumors, of course. All Russian submarine commanders had. Whispered stories about an American boat so quiet it could sail through the middle of a Soviet fleet without being detected. Ghost stories, most officers called them. Propaganda designed to intimidate. But now, listening to that impossibly faint signature, Captain Pavel Kuznetsov began to wonder if the ghost stories were true. "Bearing is changing," the sonar operator reported. "Sierra 1 appears to be maneuvering. New bearing. Captain, she's heading directly toward us." What followed was one of the most terrifying hours in Pavel Kuznetsov's career. The American submarine, for he was now certain it was American, approached K-157 with what seemed like deliberate slowness. She maneuvered around the Russian boat, approaching from different angles, testing the limits of Vapor's sonar, demonstrating capabilities that should not have been possible. At one point, the American came so close that Kuznetsov could have ordered a torpedo shot with reasonable confidence of hitting, but he didn't, not because of politics or protocol, but because he realized, with sick certainty, that if he revealed his position by flooding torpedo tubes, the American would hear him, would track him. Would, if this encounter turned violent, destroy him before he could react. The American knew exactly where Vepr was, and Kuznetsov could barely detect the American at all. After 63 minutes, the American contact faded away. Whether she departed the area or simply went completely silent, Kuznetsov never knew. What he did know was that everything he had believed about the balance of power beneath the waves had been revealed as a comfortable lie. When K-157 returned to port, Captain Kuznetsov filed a detailed report of the encounter. That report was immediately classified and forwarded to the Russian Navy's Intelligence Directorate. It was not the first such report. It would not be the last. But it was one of the reports that Dmitry Volkov would eventually compile into the document he stole on that cold November night. The question of why Volkov betrayed his country has never been fully answered. Some who knew him say it was conscience. Volkov had served aboard submarines for 15 years. He had watched friends die in accidents that might have been prevented if Soviet designers had prioritized safety over speed and secrecy. He had seen promising young officers broken by a system that demanded loyalty above competence, political reliability above honesty. The sinking of K-278 Komsomolets in 1989, with 42 of her 69 crew members killed, had affected Volkov deeply. He had known men aboard that submarine, good men. Men who deserved better than to die because their boat's damage control systems were inadequate, because their emergency procedures were flawed, because their Navy's culture prevented anyone from acknowledging these problems until it was too late. Others suggest that Volkov's motivations were simpler. The Soviet Union had collapsed. The Russia that emerged was chaotic, poor, and seemingly without purpose. Officers who had dedicated their lives to their service found their salaries unpaid for months at a time. Their expertise was suddenly worthless in a world that no longer cared about submarine warfare. Perhaps Volkov simply saw an opportunity. Western intelligence services were eager for information about Russian military capabilities. They paid well, and in the Russia of 1991, money could buy not just comfort, but survival. Whatever his reasons, Dmitry Volkov made his choice. The document he compiled was devastating in its comprehensiveness. It contained not just intelligence about American capabilities, information that had been compartmentalized and hidden from most Russian officers, but also brutally honest assessments of Russian weaknesses. It described encounters between Akula-class submarines and American boats that had never been officially acknowledged. It analyzed the technological gap between the two navies and concluded that this gap was not merely large but growing. And it contained the testimony of Russian submarine commanders who had, in confidential debriefs, admitted their fear. "I have served in submarines for 20 years, one captain was quoted as saying. "I have faced American boats dozens of times. I have always believed that skill and training could overcome any technological disadvantage. After my encounter with what I believe was a Seawolf-Class submarine, I no longer believe this. These boats are not merely better than ours. They are operating in a different realm entirely." Another captain was more direct. "If war comes, we will not survive the first week. Our submarines will be found and destroyed before they can reach their patrol areas. This is not pessimism. This is mathematics." These were not the words of cowards or defeatists. These were hardened professional warriors, men who had spent their careers preparing for a conflict they hoped would never come, and they were admitting, in the privacy of classified debriefs, that they expected to lose. The document made its way west through channels that have never been fully disclosed. Some portions appeared in American intelligence assessments within weeks of Volkov's theft. Others surfaced years later in academic studies and investigative journalism. The complete document has never been publicly released, though portions of it have been confirmed through independent sources. What happened to Dmitry Volkov remains officially unknown. Some reports suggest he defected to the West, living out his remaining years under an assumed identity. Others claim he was discovered by Russian counterintelligence and executed. The most persistent rumor, never confirmed, is that he died of natural causes in 2003, having never been identified as the source of the leak. But the consequences of his action would reshape submarine warfare for decades to come. The revelation that Russian submarine commanders feared the Seawolf-Class had profound effects on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. In Russia, it accelerated the decline of a submarine force that was already struggling to maintain readiness. Officers who might have continued their careers chose early retirement. Recruitment became more difficult as young men questioned the value of serving aboard boats that their own commanders considered outclassed. The psychological damage inflicted by the document may have been more significant than any intelligence it revealed. In the United States, the reaction was more complex. The Seawolf program had always been controversial. Each submarine cost approximately $3 billion, more than 3 times the cost of a Los Angeles-class boat. Critics argued that the Cold War's end had eliminated the threat the Seawolf was designed to counter. Why build the world's most capable anti-submarine platform when the opposing submarine force was rusting at its peers? The Volkov document provided an unexpected answer to this question. It demonstrated that American technological superiority had real psychological effects on potential adversaries. Russian commanders weren't just outgunned, they were demoralized. In any future conflict, this demoralization might prove as valuable as any weapon system. This argument helped preserve the Seawolf program, though in truncated form. The original plan called for 29 submarines. Budget pressures and changing strategic priorities eventually reduced this to just 3: USS Seawolf, USS Connecticut, and USS Jimmy Carter. But those 3 boats would become the most capable attack submarines ever built, and their capabilities would continue to evolve, incorporating lessons learned from operations that remain classified to this day. The engineering achievements that made the Seawolf-Class possible deserve examination, if only to understand why Soviet analysts had dismissed them as impossible. The submarine's reactor plant was revolutionary. Unlike previous American designs, which used mechanical pumps to circulate coolant, the Seawolf employed natural circulation at low power levels. Heat from the reactor caused the coolant to rise. Cooler water sank to replace it. No pumps meant no pump noise. At low speeds, the submarine's power plant was essentially silent. At higher power levels, the pumps did engage, but even then, the Seawolf was quieter than previous American submarines. The reason was a comprehensive approach to noise reduction that treated the entire boat as an integrated acoustic system. Every piece of machinery was mounted on special isolation mounts that prevented vibrations from reaching the hull. The propeller, or more accurately, the pump jet propulsor, was designed to eliminate the cavitation that had given away submarines since the first diesel boats. Even the submarine's steel was special, a new alloy called HY100, stronger and more acoustically damped than anything previously used in submarine construction. The result was a submarine that could approach within weapons range of any target in the world without being detected. Soviet analysts had been correct that the laws of physics applied to everyone. What they had underestimated was American engineering's ability to push those laws to their absolute limits. The Seawolf's sensors were equally impressive. Her spherical sonar array was the largest ever installed on an American submarine, with more than twice the area of the Los Angeles-class system. Combined with advanced signal processing and the boat's own quiet operation, this array could theoretically detect a conventional submarine at ranges exceeding 100 miles under ideal conditions. Against other nuclear submarines, the ranges were shorter. The ocean is a noisy place, and even the quietest submarines produce some sound. But the Seawolf consistently demonstrated the ability to detect and track targets at ranges that gave her a decisive first-shot advantage. This advantage was preserved by the submarine's weapon system. 8 torpedo tubes, arranged in 2 rows of 4, could launch a devastating salvo in seconds. The boat carried 50 weapons: torpedoes, cruise missiles, and mines, more than twice the loadout of a Los Angeles-class submarine. In exercises against other American submarines, Seawolf achieved results that alarmed even her own designers. During one test in 1998, she successfully tracked and killed 2 Los Angeles-class boats while remaining undetected herself. The opposing submarine commanders never knew she was there until the exercise referees informed them they were dead. These capabilities were exactly what the Russian commanders in the Volkov document had described. The Seawolf was not merely a better submarine. She was a different kind of weapon entirely. A hunter so silent and so capable that opposing submarines had essentially no chance of survival. The psychological impact of facing such a weapon cannot be overstated. Submarine warfare is uniquely terrifying. Unlike surface sailors, who can at least see their enemies approaching, submariners operate in perpetual blindness. They rely entirely on their sonar systems to understand the world around them. An enemy they cannot hear might as well not exist, until the moment a torpedo appears out of nowhere and begins its terminal sprint. For decades, Soviet submarine commanders had lived with this fear but managed it through training and confidence in their own capabilities. They knew the Americans were good, but they believed they were good enough to compete. They believed that skill and courage could offset technological disadvantages. The Seawolf destroyed this belief. Against a Los Angeles-class submarine, an Akula captain could reasonably expect a fair fight. Both boats would have difficulty detecting each other. Both would have to maneuver carefully, seeking any advantage. Victory would go to the captain who was more skilled, more patient, more willing to take calculated risks. Against a Seawolf, there was no fair fight. The American boat would detect the Akula first. She would track it, analyze it, develop a firing solution, and launch her weapons, all while remaining invisible. The Akula captain's first indication that he was under attack would be the sound of incoming torpedoes. By then, it would be far too late. This realization, that the ocean depths had become a hunting ground where Russian submarines were the prey, broke something fundamental in the Russian submarine force. Individual commanders might accept their own deaths as the price of service, but dying without any chance to fight back, that was something different. That was slaughter. The accounts that Volkov compiled made this devastatingly clear. Commander after commander described the same experience, detecting a faint contact, attempting to track it, losing it, and then realizing that the positions had somehow reversed. They were no longer the hunters. They had become the hunted. It was like being watched by something you could not see, one captain wrote. Every maneuver I made, every attempt to regain contact felt futile. The American knew where I was. He was playing with me, demonstrating his superiority. If this had been war, I would be dead, and I would never have known what killed me. Another commander was more philosophical. We trained for decades to fight an enemy we could understand. Now we face an enemy that exists in a realm we cannot enter. Our submarines, our tactics, our entire doctrine, these were built for a war that will never happen. The war that will happen is one we cannot win. These were not the ravings of frightened conscripts. These were the considered judgments of professional naval officers who had studied their craft for decades, and their unanimous conclusion was that the Seawolf-Class had rendered their entire submarine force obsolete. The strategic implications of this conclusion extended far beyond the underwater battlefield. Soviet military doctrine had always relied heavily on submarines. In any conflict with NATO, the submarine force had 2 primary missions. First, to hunt and destroy American aircraft carriers, which would otherwise devastate Soviet surface forces. And second, to protect Soviet ballistic missile submarines, which represented the ultimate guarantee of mutual destruction. The Akula class was central to both missions. Quiet enough to penetrate American defenses, powerful enough to threaten carriers with cruise missiles, capable enough to screen the ballistic missile boats during their transit to patrol areas, the Akula was supposed to be the backbone of Soviet naval power. The Seawolf negated all of this. Akula-class boats attempting to reach carrier battle groups would be detected and destroyed long before they came within weapons range. Akulas assigned to escort ballistic missile submarines would themselves become targets, their destruction leaving the missile boats vulnerable. The entire architecture of Soviet naval strategy would collapse. Russian planners understood this. The Volkov document made clear that senior officers had grasped the implications of American technological superiority. What they could not do was solve the problem. Building submarines to match the Seawolf would require technologies that Russia did not possess. The special steel, the advanced reactor designs, the sophisticated sensors, these were products of an industrial base that the Soviet Union had never developed, and that post-Soviet Russia could not afford to create. Improving tactics might help at the margins, but there were fundamental limits. Against an enemy you could not detect, tactics became largely irrelevant. You cannot outmaneuver what you cannot see. The only viable response was asymmetric, except that Russian submarines could not match American boats in open ocean combat, and developed strategies that avoided such combat whenever possible. This is precisely what happened. Russian submarine doctrine shifted away from the aggressive blue water operations that had characterized the Cold War. Instead, submarines increasingly operated in the relative safety of bastions, defended areas where surface ships, aircraft, and submarines could provide mutual support. But everyone understood that this was a strategy of weakness, not strength. It conceded the open oceans to the Americans and restricted Russian naval power to defensive operations close to home. The Volkov document had revealed not just a technological gap, but a strategic dead end. The years following the document's release saw a gradual decline in Russian submarine operations. Budget cuts reduced maintenance and training. Experienced officers retired and were not replaced. Boats that might once have patrolled the Atlantic or Pacific sat idle at their piers, their crews struggling to maintain basic readiness. There were exceptions, of course. Russia continued to develop new submarine classes, and some of these boats represented significant improvements over their predecessors. The Yasen-class attack submarines, in particular, incorporated technologies that narrowed the gap with American designs. But the psychological damage had been done. Russian submarine commanders who had once believed in their invincibility had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. They had been outclassed for years, and their own leadership had hidden this fact from them. Trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Officers who learned that their superiors had deliberately concealed vital information about enemy capabilities began questioning what else they might not have been told. A service that had once prided itself on technical excellence and warrior spirit became plagued by doubt and disillusionment. Some historians argue that the Volkov document contributed to the series of disasters that struck the Russian submarine force in the 1990s and early 2000s. The sinking of Kursk in 2000, which killed all 118 men aboard, was officially attributed to a torpedo malfunction. But investigators also found evidence of poor maintenance, inadequate training, and institutional culture that discouraged reporting problems. These failures were not caused by the Volkov document, but the document revealed a system that had prioritized secrecy over safety, political reliability over technical competence, comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The same institutional pathologies that had hidden American capabilities from Russian commanders had also hidden the decay eating away at their own submarine force. The Seawolf-Class itself continued to evolve even as the threat it was designed to counter diminished. The 3 boats that were eventually built represented billions of dollars of investment in capabilities that some critics argued were no longer needed. But those capabilities proved valuable in ways that no one had anticipated. USS Jimmy Carter, the 3rd Seawolf-Class submarine, was modified extensively during construction to support intelligence and special operations missions. Her specific capabilities remain highly classified, but public sources indicate that she can deploy underwater drones, tap undersea communications cables, and deliver Navy SEAL teams for covert missions. USS Connecticut and USS Seawolf, meanwhile, have become primary assets for operations in environments where stealth is paramount. Their extreme quietness makes them ideal for surveillance missions close to adversary coastlines, missions where a louder submarine would risk detection and potential confrontation. Perhaps most importantly, the Seawolf-Class has served as a bridge to the Virginia-class submarines that now form the backbone of the American attack submarine fleet. Lessons learned from Seawolf's design and operation have been incorporated into Virginia, producing boats that are nearly as quiet but far less expensive. The Russian submarine force, meanwhile, has slowly begun to recover. New boats are entering service, training has improved. A new generation of officers, too young to remember the despair of the 1990s, is rising through the ranks. But the memory of the Seawolf-Class and the document that revealed how thoroughly it had outclassed its opponents continues to haunt Russian naval thinking. Every new design, every new doctrine, every strategic decision is made with an awareness that the Americans achieved capabilities once thought impossible. And somewhere in the files of Russian naval intelligence, perhaps, there still exists a document compiled by a man named Dmitry Volkov, a document that changed the history of submarine warfare without a single weapon being fired. The final pages of the Volkov document contained something unexpected, a series of recommendations. Volkov was not content simply to document Russian weaknesses and American strengths. He wanted to suggest a path forward, a way out of the strategic trap that his own analysis had identified. His recommendations fell into 3 categories. First, he argued for radical honesty. The policy of concealing enemy capabilities from Russian commanders, Volkov wrote, had produced precisely the demoralization it was meant to prevent. Officers who learned the truth through experience, facing a Seawolf in the depths, realizing too late that they had no chance, suffered worse psychological damage than those who were told honestly from the beginning. A warrior can face any enemy if he understands what he faces, Volkov wrote. What he cannot face is the discovery that his own leaders have lied to him, have sent him into battle believing himself capable when he was not. This is not leadership. This is betrayal. Second, Volkov called for a fundamental reassessment of Russian submarine doctrine. The goal of matching American capabilities, boat for boat, was unrealistic and would remain so for the foreseeable future. Instead, Russia should focus on asymmetric strategies that leveraged its geographical advantages. We cannot build submarines as quiet as the Americans, Volkov acknowledged, but we do not need to. Our ballistic missile submarines do not need to hunt Americans. They need only to survive long enough to launch their weapons if deterrence fails. Our attack submarines do not need to challenge American carriers in the open ocean. They need only to defend our own coastal waters and threaten any enemy who approaches. This was, in essence, a call for a smaller, more focused submarine force, one that accepted its limitations and worked within them rather than pursuing impossible goals. Third, and most controversially, Volkov argued for international cooperation on submarine safety. The Cold War had produced a culture of secrecy so extreme that both sides had refused to share information that might prevent accidents and save lives. This secrecy had cost hundreds of lives on both sides. The ocean does not care about politics, Volkov wrote. A fire aboard a submarine kills communist and capitalist alike. A reactor malfunction contaminates waters that belong to everyone. If we cannot be allies, we can at least be professionals. We can share the knowledge that keeps our sailors alive without compromising the secrets that keep our nation secure. This recommendation was never officially adopted. But in the years following the Cold War's end, informal contacts between American and Russian submariners did increase. Former adversaries found that they had more in common than their governments had ever acknowledged. They faced the same dangers, worried about the same failures, mourned the same losses. Whether Volkov's document contributed to this rapprochement is impossible to know. But its spirit, the belief that honesty and professionalism could transcend political divisions, seems to have influenced the submarine community on both sides of what was once an unbridgeable divide. The story of the Seawolf-Class and the document that revealed its impact is, in many ways, a story about the limits of secrecy. The Soviet Union believed that hiding American capabilities from its own officers would preserve morale and fighting spirit. Instead, it produced a culture of comfortable lies that left the submarine force psychologically unprepared for the challenges it actually faced. The United States believed that concealing the Seawolf's capabilities from the world would preserve its strategic advantages. Instead, the revelation of those capabilities, through Volkov's theft and other intelligence breaches, may have contributed more to American security than any weapon system. Enemies who knew they were outmatched hesitated to challenge American dominance. And in the submariners themselves, Russian and American alike, believed that the Cold War's end would bring peace and security. Instead, it brought a decade of uncertainty, decline, and tragedy that tested the submarine services of both nations. What remains, decades later, is a question that Dmitry Volkov posed in the final paragraph of his stolen document. What do we owe to truth? For Volkov, the answer was clear. He owed truth, his career, his security, perhaps his life. He gave all of these to reveal what his own government had hidden from those who most needed to know. Others might have made different choices. They might have argued that truth must be balanced against security, that some secrets are necessary for national survival, that Volkov's theft endangered lives and compromised operations in ways that he could never fully understand. These arguments have merit. The world of submarine warfare is not a place for naive idealism. Hard choices must be made, and some of those choices involve deciding what truths to reveal and what lies to maintain. But Volkov's document endures as a reminder that lies, too, have costs. The submarine commanders who faced the Seawolf without understanding what they faced paid a price. The young sailors who died aboard Kursk and Komsomolets paid a price. The entire Russian submarine service paid a price, in morale and readiness and institutional trust. Whether that price was higher or lower than the price of honesty is a question that no one can definitively answer. But it is a question that echoes through every discussion of military technology, intelligence, and the balance between security and truth. The Seawolf-Class submarines continue to serve, their exact capabilities still classified, their operations still hidden from public view. They patrol the depths of oceans around the world, maintaining the underwater superiority that their designers promised and their crews deliver. Somewhere in those same oceans, Russian submarines patrol as well. Their commanders are better trained than their predecessors of the 1990s, their boats more capable than those that faced the first Seawolves. The gap has narrowed, though by how much remains a matter of classified analysis. But in the archives of naval intelligence on both sides, there exist documents that tell a different story. They tell of a time when one nation achieved such overwhelming advantage that its adversaries knew despair. They tell of men who faced certain death if war came and found the courage to continue serving anyway. They tell of one man who decided that truth was more important than loyalty, and changed history with a stolen folder. The ocean keeps its secrets well. Submarines vanish into the depths and return weeks or months later, their missions known only to those with the highest clearances. What happens beneath the waves stays beneath the waves, hidden from satellites and journalists and historians alike. But occasionally, a secret escapes. A document finds its way into unexpected hands. A story that was meant to remain hidden becomes part of the historical record. This is one of those stories. It is the story of the Seawolf-Class, and the document that revealed why the captains of Russia's finest submarines feared to face them. It is a story of technology and terror, of secrets and sacrifice, of men who served their nations in silence and darkness. It is a story that deserves to be remembered, even as the Cold War recedes into history and new challenges emerge from the depths. For as long as nations build submarines, this story will remain relevant. It reminds us that technological superiority is not merely a matter of weapons and systems, but of the human beings who operate them. It reminds us that the psychological dimension of warfare is as important as the physical dimension. And it reminds us that the truth, however painful, is always more valuable than comfortable lies. The Seawolf-Class proved this in the frozen waters of the Arctic and the dark depths of the Atlantic. The document that Dmitry Volkov stole proved it in the corridors of power on both sides of what was once the Iron Curtain. And the men who served beneath the waves, Russian and American, hunter and hunted, proved it with their lives, their careers, and their willingness to face an enemy they could barely comprehend. This is their story. May it never be forgotten. The Russian analysis, portions of which eventually leaked to Western researchers, was remarkable for its candor. Our submarine was detected, tracked, and shadowed for over 1 hour by an opponent we could barely perceive, the conclusion stated. If this had been an actual combat engagement, K-157 would have been destroyed with all hands. For the Russian submarine service, the implications were devastating. Every patrol became a potential death sentence. Every encounter with a possible American contact became an exercise in helplessness. The Volkov document captured this psychological dimension with precision. "We are sailors of a ghost fleet," one commander wrote. "Our boats exist, our crews exist, but our purpose has become a phantom. We patrol oceans we no longer control. We prepare for wars we cannot win. In the quiet hours of the night watch, we know the truth. We are obsolete. We are already dead. We simply continue moving because no one has yet told us to stop." The Russian submarine force did not collapse overnight. It continued to operate, continued to train, continued to develop new designs. But something fundamental had changed. The service that had once seen itself as the equal of any navy in the world had been forced to confront its limitations. The Seawolf-Class submarines will eventually leave service, replaced by newer designs with capabilities we can only imagine. But the questions that Volkov's document raised will endure as long as nations build submarines and send men beneath the waves. What do we owe to those who serve in silence and darkness? What do we owe to truth? And what happens when the truth reveals that everything we believed about our own capabilities was wrong? These are the questions that haunted Dmitry Volkov as he slid that folder across the desk on that cold November night in Severomorsk. They are the questions that haunted the submarine commanders who faced the Seawolf and returned to port changed forever. The Seawolf-Class answered these questions with steel and technology. The Volkov document answered them with testimony and analysis. But the ultimate answers can only come from the human beings who wrestle with these questions every day. The sailors, the officers, the planners, and the leaders who must decide what truths to tell and what lies to maintain. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes the secrets escape, and when they do, they change everything.